Look, let me please kind of extend the welcome to the CSS kind of 2020 Regulatory Compliance Forum. The theme of today's conference is managing regulatory change in the funds industry. I think change is the kind of key word that we really want to focus on and concentrate on throughout today and the sessions that we have. On that theme, Stephen Hawking, he's alleged to have made this statement during his Oxford graduation speech, that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change. If you actually go to the Facebook page of the World Economic Forum, you'll see it kind of writ large there as well. There's actually quite a dispute about whether he actually said that, because if you look at anything he's written or spoken on, he never ever uttered those words. Although Kitty Ferguson, who is the biographer of Stephen Hawking in Stephen Hawking's An Unfettered Mind, said that at the end of the day, she thinks it's the kind of thing he would like to have said. So we shall take it as said that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change is a quote from Stephen Hawking's. And it seems rather fitting that we should reference Stephen Hawking's, given that throughout today we're looking at change. We have a guest speaker at the end of the day, former curator of the Nobel Museum. But that said, Stephen Hawking never won the Nobel Prize. Unlike quantum mechanics, there's a very, very simple explanation for that. And that is that the Nobel Prize for Science is actually awarded on the basis of observational, tested, and proven science. You don't win an award for a big idea. And Hawking's radiation, which was his big idea, that black holes aren't actually black, but emit radiation until they eventually fade away, probably going through all sorts of kind of color changes and hues en route, is something that hasn't been observed, nor has it been tested or proven. And the agenda today, I think if we dive into that agenda, we will be looking at the proven and observational, the known knowns in terms of the deliverables around SFTR. Also those known unknowns in terms of the Brexit landscape and what that will mean for regulatory compliance and how regulators are impacting market liquidity. But we'll also be looking at the big ideas as well. The idea about how do we optimize our approach to regulatory compliance. And we have a panel on compliance as a service to actually look at how we move to that optimal position. I think amongst the biggest ideas we'll be exploring today is how we move from those tactical deliverables around a prescribed regulation that's set in time, the clock is ticking, we have to kind of tick that box. We all saw that happen around MiFID II. It was very much a box-ticking exercise. But one thing we really need to think about and explore is how we move from that tactical as a starting point on a journey towards more strategic ways to think about how we develop a regulatory compliance operating model. Who do we need to reach out to? What trusted parties can we use to actually define and support that operational model as we move forward? We'll be exploring that in those three critical themes that we're going to be having in our interactive boardrooms later this morning. And that is around solutions to global funds reporting and all the periodic filings that are associated with that and the template creation. Global transaction reporting and those high-frequency reporting around EMIR, MiFIR, and SFTR. And the ground to actually deliver on that tactical requirement of SFTR, but then have the look back to consolidate all of those reporting protocols and achieve the economies of scale and efficiency, creating an operating model around your transaction reporting requirements. And then finally, global threshold management. And again, all of those are interrelated, because if once you're investing in funds, there is a transaction on the back end of that. One quote that Stephen Hawking is most clearly attributed with is that our greatest achievements come through talking. With technology at our disposal, he said, the possibilities are unbounded. All we need to do is make sure we keep talking. There are 5 areas that I'd like to talk about in my opening address this morning. That is our use of data, the total cost of ownership of complying with that raft of regulations that face us, how we manage risk, how we approach regulatory change, and finally how we scale for that. Let me address the first one, data. A major observation on the current regulatory reporting frameworks across most financial institutions is the issue of fragmented data, sourcing, processing, and technologies. This begs the question, how can you manage regulatory data more strategically? You need to ask yourself, how streamlined is your data consumption? To what extent is it coming from disparate systems, disparate sources? Does data still remain a challenge, or do you view it as an asset? Are you building a central repository of data, or RBOR, a regulatory book of record, that can be repurposed to create links between common sets of data and homogeneous data sets, provide greater control, and can be shared with regulators across a raft of regulations about repurposing the data? It's data as capital, data as an asset. It's really exploring that big idea about shifting our mindset. The second theme is that of TCO, the total cost of ownership. The cost and effort of regulatory compliance continues to be one of the business community's biggest concerns. Here the issue is, how do you do more with what you have? Economies of scale through automation and the consolidation of vendor relationships is one way to achieve that. To move from disparate point solutions, that tactical deliverable I was talking about, and in-house manual processes, to an end-to-end integrated regulatory compliance operating model. And then we have managing risk. The greatest compliance challenge a board expects to face is obtaining comfort that regulatory risk is effectively managed. So how do you go about mitigating operational and regulatory risk? Vendor risk, we are a vendor, can be a single point of failure. So you need to ask yourself, who is the vendor you are choosing? Are they too small to manage that operating model as you build out your regulatory compliance approach? Or are they too big to care? As we've seen with MiFID II, multiple vendors can just lead to more complexity and more cost. When I was looking at MiFID II, when we were first contemplating forming the CSS platform, that was one regulation that really stood out for me. It had a best execution requirement, a trade and transaction reporting requirement, a product governance requirement, and all the collection and validation normalization of the data sets that had to be rolled into all of those elements. I often recall, kind of anecdotally, meeting a COO of a kind of mid-sized asset management firm. And I was telling him, this is back in 17, late 17, and I was remarking at the time, how we were building this CSS with a platform that would have a breadth of solution offering, have a global footprint, what we very much are today. And he said, look, that's great, John. Really great idea. Come in the new year. I'm too busy now. I'm trying to cope with MiFID II. We've got a 1st of January deadline, 18 on that. It's all hands to the pumps on that deliverable. So we scheduled something in for 4 months' time. I got a call 2 weeks later. And he asked me to come in and sit with him and his chief compliance officer, and actually said, we have RFP with 16 different vendors to actually deliver on each one of those pieces of MiFID II, and we're totally lost. So, one of the key things with risk is how do you move from those disparate point solutions to that integrated end-to-end solution and eradicate those manual processes on the way? And can you mitigate that risk by working with a partner who's a trusted vendor of size, with a breadth of product offering, and that global footprint? Then we come to regulatory change. There, the question is, this is the nub of the matter for me. So how do you think about compliance more strategically? Do you in-house have the deep knowledge and technical capabilities to move swiftly and with agility and future-proof what you're doing around that regulatory compliance operating model? Are you an active investor in that space? I mean, I often hear that regulatory compliance is something we have to do. It does not create shareholder value. It's very difficult to get boards to engage, to actually support and build that out. So does it not make sense to work with those partners who are actively investing in that space, seeing the new regulations that are over the horizon, that have the agility to shift and to build? Again, we come back to that question around regulatory change. Are you integrating and consolidating those vendor relationships, seeking to achieve those economies of scale? It's about looking at regulation, not as one tactical deliverable, but as a commodity within the organization, and to seek out homogeneous responses to it. Closely allied to that, and it's the fifth issue that I think we should be addressing and considering as we move throughout the day, is that of scalability. How can you scale to meet the growth expectations and business objectives of the company? I think you have to start by asking how big is the regulatory compliance challenge in 2020? I'll tell you how big it is. There are 374 pieces of separate legislation being implemented by financial institutions this year alone. To scale, it's mind-boggling how someone can scale in such a fluid and vast environment. So that, again, comes back to the core message that I wanted to convey, to move beyond the reactive, the observable, the tactical deployments around SFTR, to work with a trusted vendor that's delivering to a prescribed deadline and walk that regulatory path with them to help them define, support, and build out that regulatory compliance operating model with you. The journey from tactical to strategic is very much a journey. It is not an either-or. And it can actually revolutionize the way we think about regulatory compliance, moving it from a cost center towards a cost-efficient center of excellence, and actually even beyond that, as a business contributor, a competitive differentiator. If you build out that regulatory compliance operating model, it can actually differentiate you from the competition. We're already seeing that happen in ESG, something we'll be covering at the end of today's agenda. And even beyond that, can we see a future where you'll actually get a AAA rating for the quality of your compliance and that operating model you have within the firm? And that's the journey and the challenge, moving from the tactical to the strategic, and the big idea that I was talking about. Let's return to the theme of intelligently adapting to change. This rather pleasant-looking elderly gentleman is Edward Osborne Wilson, esteemed biologist. He's actually the world expert on ants. I put Wilson up here. I've managed spectacularly, given that we have a speaker from the Nobel Museum at the end of the day, to put up people that have never won the Nobel Prize. But he came somewhat closer than Stephen Hawking. In 1990, he won the Cranford Prize, which is awarded by the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, to really support those areas of science not covered by the Nobel Prize. He also won the Pulitzer Prize in 1979 for his book entitled On Human Nature. Commenting on the age in which we lived, he came out with a quote that is very, very kind of close to my heart and really inspired me when we started building this platform. And it goes back to that point I was making about how we use our data and our total cost of ownership, that regulatory book of record I was talking about. Because let's face it, we do live in an age, we live in an industry where we're drowning in information and starving for wisdom. Could not be a better description. E.O. Wilson went on to say that henceforth the world would be run by synthesizers, people able to put together the right information at the right time, think critically about it, and make wise choices based upon it. To synthesize is to combine into a coherent whole. So when we go back to the theme of today, managing regulatory change in the funds industry, I would contend the real challenge we have is how do we create that coherent whole from those point-to-point solutions we're trying to deliver? And to what extent do we need to look to the right partner to help accomplish that as we move forward? Thank you.